The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Golden Crown Hotel, casting elegant shadows across the marble floors. The owner, Mrs. Chen, stood before her bedroom mirror, carefully replacing her designer blazer with a simple black uniform. Her fingers traced over the name tag that read Annie, her mother's name, chosen specially for this undercover mission. 10 years of building her hotel empire had taught her one thing: success meant never losing touch with the ground reality. That's why, every few months, she would work different positions in her hotels. Today marked the beginning of her week as a waitress in the hotel's 5-star restaurant, the Crystal Room. As she tied her hair back into a neat bun, memories of her early days flooded back. She had started as a dishwasher in a small diner, taking extra shifts to put herself through business school. Those years had taught her more about hospitality than any fancy degree ever could. "Ready for your first day?" asked Mr. Rodriguez, the restaurant manager, as she entered through the staff entrance. He was one of the few people who knew her true identity. She nodded, adjusting her comfortable work shoes, a far cry from her usual designer heels. During the morning briefing, she sat among her employees, taking notes like any new hire would. The other waiters were kind, showing her how to use the ordering system and sharing tips about regular customers' preferences. A young waiter named Kai demonstrated the proper way to carry multiple plates, and Mrs. Chen pretended to be nervous about dropping them, making everyone laugh. "Just remember," said Maya, a senior waitress with kind eyes, "shoulders back, head high, and smile like you mean it." These folks can smell fear. The staff shared a knowing chuckle, unaware that their trainee owned the very ground they stood on. As the lunch service began, Mrs. Chen found herself falling into an easy rhythm. She welcomed guests, memorized orders, and navigated the busy kitchen with growing confidence. Her feet were already starting to ache, but she felt more alive than she had in months of board meetings and investor calls. She served businessmen who barely looked up from their phones, young couples celebrating special occasions, and families with children who left more food on the floor than in their mouths. Each interaction taught her something new about her hotel's operations. "Table 7 wants their steak well done," called out Chef Thompson from the kitchen. "And they've already sent it back twice." Mrs. Chen grabbed the plate, remembering how she used to handle such situations in her early days. As she approached the table, she noticed a group of expensively dressed women being seated in her section. Something about their demanding gestures toward the host made her pause. Little did she know, these women would soon turn her simple observation week into something much more significant. The final hour of her first shift approached, and Mrs. Chen's muscles ached in places she'd forgotten existed. She watched her staff with newfound appreciation, the way they maintained their composure during rush hour, how they supported each other during difficult moments, and their unwavering professionalism even when faced with demanding customers. As she helped wipe down tables for the dinner service, she overheard 2 regular customers praising the consistent service quality to the manager. Her heart swelled with pride, not as an owner, but as a member of this hardworking team. She understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges, especially with that group of women who had made a dinner reservation. But for now, she was content knowing that her decision to work undercover was already providing valuable insights into the heart of her hotel's operations. Standing in the staff room at the end of her shift, Mrs. Chen quietly observed her employees sharing stories about their day, completely unaware that the person laughing at their jokes was the same one whose portrait hung in the hotel lobby. This, she thought, was where the real magic of hospitality happened, not in the fancy boardrooms, but in the warm camaraderie of the people who brought the hotel to life every single day. The dinner rush was in full swing at the Crystal Room when they walked in. 5 women dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than a server's monthly salary. Mrs. Chen, still in her role as Annie the waitress, watched as they were escorted to table 12 in her section. Their perfume left a trail of expensive scents in their wake. The leader of the group, a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, didn't even look up from her phone as Mrs. Chen approached with water and menus. The others followed suit, creating a wall of indifference that any server would find intimidating. But Mrs. Chen had faced tougher crowds in her journey from dishwasher to hotel owner. "Good evening, ladies. Welcome to the Crystal Room. I'm Annie, and I'll be taking care of you tonight," she said warmly, placing water glasses on the table. The blonde woman finally looked up, her eyes scanning Mrs. Chen's uniform with the kind of look usually reserved for examining insects. "Well, Annie," she said, drawing out the name like it was beneath her to speak it, "we'll start with your finest champagne." "I assume you know what that is." Her friends tittered, sharing knowing looks. Mrs. Chen maintained her professional smile. "Of course. We have an excellent Dom Perignon Rose Gold that I would highly recommend. She'd personally selected it for the wine list last month, but of course they didn't need to know that." "At least she knows something," one of the women whispered, loud enough to be heard. Another added, "Must have read it off a card." More laughter followed. As Mrs. Chen walked away to fetch their champagne, she overheard one of them say, "Can you believe they let people like her serve in a place like this? Standards really have dropped." The comment stung, not because it was directed at her, but because it reminded her of all the hard-working people who faced such treatment daily. She thought of Maya Kai and all her other staff who smiled through similar situations. When she returned with the champagne, the women were huddled over their phones, showing each other photos of their recent shopping sprees. Mrs. Chen opened the bottle with practiced ease, a skill she'd never forgotten from her early days in the industry. "Oh my," the blonde woman said, examining her glass with exaggerated concern. "This glass has a smudge. Did you even check these before bringing them out?" She held up the perfectly clean glass to the light. "I apologize if there's any issue," Mrs. Chen replied calmly. "I'd be happy to bring you a fresh glass." "You should be sorry," another woman chimed in. "Do you know how much this champagne costs?" "Of course you don't. It's probably more than you make in a week." The other diners nearby were beginning to take notice of the situation. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to hear, but no one said anything. Mrs. Chen had seen this scene play out countless times in restaurants, the uncomfortable silence of witnesses who wished they could help but didn't know how. As she brought their new glasses, the women were already planning how to make their dining experience more entertaining. Mrs. Chen could see it in their eyes, that look people get when they think they've found an easy target. "Annie dear," the blonde woman called out as Mrs. Chen was about to leave. "We're ready to order, but we'll need you to write everything down. We wouldn't want you to get confused." She smiled sweetly, but her eyes were cold. Mrs. Chen pulled out her notepad, even though she had an excellent memory. Sometimes, she reflected, it was better to let people think they had the upper hand. Besides, every interaction was teaching her something about what her staff dealt with daily. Little did these women know that their behavior was about to lead to one of the most memorable evenings in the Crystal Room's history. As Mrs. Chen took their increasingly complicated orders, she couldn't help but think that sometimes the best lessons in life come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The evening took a sharp turn for the worse when Mrs. Chen brought out the women's appetizers. The blonde woman looked at her perfectly prepared tuna tartare with disgust. "This isn't what I ordered," she declared, though it was exactly what she asked for. "I specifically said I wanted it less raw." Mrs. Chen kept her voice steady. "I apologize for any misunderstanding. The tartare is traditionally served raw, but I'd be happy to have the kitchen prepare something else for you." "Well, I suppose someone with your background wouldn't understand fine dining," another woman snickered. "In fact, I'm surprised you even know what tartare is." The other women at the table barely contained their laughter. One of them deliberately knocked over her water glass, sending ice cubes scattering across the white tablecloth. "Oops," she said with fake concern. "You'll clean that up, won't you, Annie?" As Mrs. Chen carefully mopped up the spill, she noticed Yun Kai watching from across the room, his face tight with anger. She gave him a small shake of her head, signaling him to stay back. This was a teaching moment, though not in the way these women intended. "The bread is cold," complained another woman, poking at the freshly baked rolls. "And these butter pieces are too big. Don't you know how to properly serve butter?" Mrs. Chen had personally trained her staff on every detail of service, including how to properly quenelle butter. But she simply nodded and said, "I'll bring you fresh bread and butter right away." When she returned, the blonde woman was holding up her wine glass, swirling it dramatically. "Ladies, let me show you how to properly taste wine." Though I doubt our server here has ever had anything finer than boxed wine. The comment triggered another round of cruel laughter. At a nearby table, an elderly couple exchanged disapproving glances, while a young family hurriedly asked for their check, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. "Annie," called out one of the women, "my fork has water spots. Don't you people know how to polish silverware properly?" She held up a spotless fork, turning it under the light. As Mrs. Chen went to fetch new silverware, she overheard one woman say, "Can you believe they let people like her work in a place like this? I mean, what's next?" The kitchen staff watched sympathetically as Mrs. Chen entered to get the replacement items. Chef Thompson, who knew her true identity, raised an eyebrow in question. She gave him a reassuring smile. She had handled worse situations while building her business empire. Returning to the table, Mrs. Chen found the women huddled over their phones again, showing each other photos of their luxury vacations. "Oh, Annie," the blonde woman called out without looking up, "you probably dream of staying in places like this, don't you? But let's be realistic. Someone like you would be lucky to afford the staff quarters." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Mrs. Chen. She owned not just this hotel, but a chain of luxury properties across 3 continents. Yet here she was, being lectured about fine dining and luxury by women who had no idea who they were really talking to. "The chicken is too dry," one woman complained about her perfectly cooked entree. "And this wine doesn't complement it at all. Though I wouldn't expect you to understand wine pairings." Mrs. Chen had personally curated the hotel's wine list and had won several awards for her knowledge of wine. Still, she maintained her composure, saying only, "Would you like to try a different wine? I'd be happy to make a recommendation." The women exchanged amused glances. "Oh, honey," the blonde woman said condescendingly, "why don't you just get your manager? Clearly, you're not qualified to make such suggestions." Little did they know, their request for management would lead to a moment they'd never forget. As Mrs. Chen walked away from the table, she decided it was time to end this charade. These women needed to learn a lesson about judging people based on their appearance and perceived status. The blonde woman's voice cut through the elegant dining room like a knife. "I want to speak to the owner of this hotel right now," she demanded, loud enough to make other diners pause mid-conversation. "This service is absolutely unacceptable." Mrs. Chen stood quietly beside the table, her hands clasped in front of her uniform. The past hour had been a parade of deliberately spilled drinks, sent-back dishes, and thinly veiled insults. Now, it seemed, they were ready for their grand finale. "Someone of your background," the blonde woman continued, gesturing vaguely at Mrs. Chen, "clearly doesn't understand the level of service expected in an establishment like this. I'm personal friends with several hotel owners, and I can assure you they would be appalled." A young couple at the next table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The husband half rose, as if wanting to say something, but his wife touched his arm gently, and he sat back down. The entire restaurant had become an unwilling audience to this drama. "I'm sure the owner would be very interested to hear about how you've ruined our evening," another woman added, adjusting her pearl necklace with manicured fingers. "Do you even realize how much money we spend here?" Mrs. Chen thought about all the hardworking people who had helped her build this hotel from the ground up. The construction workers who laid each brick, the housekeepers who maintained its sparkle, and the servers who maintained their dignity in the face of customers like these. "My friend here sits on several charity boards," the blonde woman boasted, gesturing to one of her companions. "We could have your job with one phone call. In fact, we probably should. It would be doing this hotel a favor." The other women nodded in agreement, their jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandeliers that Mrs. Chen had personally selected during the hotel's renovation. One of them pulled out her phone, presumably to start recording. "Actually," another woman chimed in, "we should speak to the owner about the hiring standards here. I mean, look at her. Does she really fit the image of a luxury hotel? What were they thinking?" Mrs. Chen felt a surge of emotion, not for herself, but for every service worker who had ever endured similar treatment without the power to respond. She thought about Maya's kind eyes, Kay's youthful determination, and Chef Thompson's unwavering professionalism. "I don't mean to be rude," the blonde woman said, clearly meaning to be exactly that, "but someone like you should be serving at a roadside diner, not a 5-star hotel. Now, get the owner. I'm sure they'll want to hear about this personally." The irony of the situation almost made Mrs. Chen smile. These women, so certain of their superiority, had no idea they were insulting the very person they were demanding to see. The owner they wanted to complain to had been serving them all evening. "Very well," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "I'll get the owner for you right away." She turned and walked toward the staff area with measured steps, knowing that the next few moments would be unforgettable for everyone in the restaurant. Behind her, she could hear the women continuing their commentary. Can you believe how she just walked away? No apology, no nothing. The service industry really isn't what it used to be. "I can't wait to see her face when the owner comes," another added with obvious glee. "She'll be looking for a new job by tomorrow." As Mrs. Chen reached the staff area, she saw her employees watching with concern. They had witnessed everything but remained professional, just as she had trained them to be. Mr. Rodriguez, the restaurant manager, stood ready to intervene if needed, but Mrs. Chen gave him a small smile. The time had come to shed her disguise as Annie the waitress. These women had asked to speak to the owner, and they were about to get exactly what they wanted, though not in the way they expected. Mrs. Chen straightened her shoulders, knowing that what happened next would teach a lesson these women would never forget. In the private staff area, Mrs. Chen opened her locker and pulled out a garment bag. Inside was her signature cream-colored designer suit, the one she'd worn on the cover of Business Monthly last year. She changed quickly, pinning her owner's badge to her lapel and letting her hair down from its tight bun. The transformation was striking. Gone was Annie the waitress, replaced by the confident hotel owner who had built an empire from scratch. She straightened her collar and took a deep breath, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. Back in the dining room, the 5 women were still laughing among themselves, probably imagining the satisfaction of getting a server fired. The blonde woman was gesturing dramatically, recreating what she clearly thought was a poor service experience. "Ladies," Mrs. Chen said as she approached their table, her voice clear and authoritative. The blonde woman turned, ready to launch into her complaint, but the words died on her lips. The other women's smiles froze as they realized something was very wrong. "I understand you wanted to speak with the owner of the Golden Crown Hotel," Mrs. Chen continued, her tone professional but firm. She pulled out her business card and placed it on the table. "I'm Mrs. Chen, CEO and owner of the Golden Crown Hotel Group." The silence that fell over the table was deafening. The blonde woman's face turned pale, then red. One of her friends knocked over a wine glass, but this time no one made a snide comment about cleaning it up. But you were?" one woman stammered, looking back and forth between Mrs. Chen's elegant suit and the service uniform she'd been wearing just minutes ago. "Yes, I was your server, Annie," Mrs. Chen confirmed. "I regularly work alongside my staff to ensure the highest quality of service in all my hotels, and I must say, tonight has been quite educational." The other diners in the restaurant had stopped pretending not to watch. Some were hiding smiles behind their napkins. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything were nodding in approval. "I've spent the past hour experiencing firsthand how some guests treat our hard-working staff," Mrs. Chen continued. "I've been called unqualified, ignorant, and inappropriate for this establishment, the very establishment I built from the ground up." One of the women opened her mouth to speak, but Mrs. Chen held up her hand gently. "Please allow me to finish. You mentioned knowing several hotel owners. Well, now you can say you know one more, though perhaps not in the way you expected." The blonde woman's phone, which she'd been so eager to record with earlier, lay forgotten on the table. Her friends, who had been so quick to laugh at Annie's expense, now couldn't meet Mrs. Chen's eyes. "You see, I started my career as a dishwasher," Mrs. Chen explained, her voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "Every position in this hotel, from housekeeper to server to chef, I've done them all. They taught me the true meaning of hospitality, something that has nothing to do with designer clothes or expensive jewelry." She gestured to Maya and Kai, who were watching from their stations. "Every person who works in this hotel is here because they exemplify the values of hard work, dignity, and respect for themselves and for others." The women sat in stunned silence as Mrs. Chen picked up their bill folder. "Tonight's dinner will be complimentary," she said, surprising everyone. "Consider it an investment in your education about the dangers of judging people based on their appearance or position." As she turned to leave, she added one final comment. I believe you mentioned sitting on several charity boards. Perhaps consider adding one that promotes workplace dignity and respect. After tonight's experience, I'm sure you'd have some valuable insights to share. The women watched, mortified, as Mrs. Chen walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The other diners burst into spontaneous applause, and several servers had to hide their grins behind their serving trays. It was a moment that would be talked about in hospitality circles for years to come, the night when 5 socialites learned that appearances can be deceiving and respect should be given to everyone, regardless of their uniform. In her private office overlooking the city lights, Mrs. Chen sat behind her desk, still wearing her cream-colored suit from the confrontation. The 5 women sat across from her, their earlier confidence completely deflated. The blonde woman kept smoothing her designer dress, a nervous habit that seemed to surface every few seconds. Let me share something with you, Mrs. Chen began, her voice calm but firm. 20 years ago, I was working as a dishwasher in a small restaurant. The owner there taught me something valuable. Every position in hospitality deserves respect, from the person who changes the sheets to the person who signs the checks. She opened a leather folder on her desk, revealing printed screenshots of their restaurant booking history. You've dined at my hotel 37 times in the past year. That's 37 times you've been served by people you seem to think are beneath you. One of the women shifted uncomfortably in her chair. We didn't mean to, she started, but fell silent under Mrs. Chen's steady gaze. I believe you did mean to, Mrs. Chen replied. Every comment, every spilled drink, every demand was carefully chosen to make your server feel small. The question is, why? The blonde woman's eyes filled with tears. My mother was a waitress, she whispered, surprising everyone. She worked 2 jobs to put me through school. I guess somewhere along the way, I forgot what that felt like. Mrs. Chen nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. Sometimes the cruelest behavior came from those trying hardest to forget their own past. Do you know what impressed me most about my staff tonight? She continued. Not one of them broke character. Not one of them treated you the way you treated them. That's true hospitality, maintaining dignity even when others try to take it from you. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering city below. This hotel employs over 300 people. Each one has a story, dreams, and responsibilities. Many are putting themselves through school, supporting families, or building better lives. Turning back to the women, she continued, the young man who parked your car. He's working to pay for his sister's medical school. The woman who cleaned your table between courses. She's raising 3 kids on her own and never misses a day of work. The women looked down at their expensive handbags, shame evident on their faces. I could ban you from all my properties, Mrs. Chen said, causing them to look up sharply. It would be easy and perhaps justified. But I don't believe in solving disrespect with punishment. Instead, she pulled out 5 envelopes. These are invitations to our Staff Appreciation Day next month. I'd like you to come, not as guests but as servers. 1 full shift, experiencing what it's like on the other side. The blonde woman's hand trembled as she took her envelope. And if we refuse? Then you'll miss an opportunity to grow, Mrs. Chen replied simply. And yes, you'll also find your names on our Do Not Accept list at all our properties worldwide. She walked around her desk, her presence commanding yet compassionate. Success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about how you treat people on your way there. Tonight, you chose to treat people poorly. Next month, you'll have a chance to make a different choice. As the women stood to leave, visibly shaken by the evening's events, Mrs. Chen added one final thought. The person you look down on today might be signing your check tomorrow. But more importantly, they deserve your respect regardless of their position. The women filed out silently, clutching their envelopes. As the door closed behind them, Mrs. Chen smiled slightly, knowing that sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Through her office window, she could see her staff going about their evening duties, heads held high, moving with purpose and dignity. Tonight had been more than just a lesson for 5 privileged women. It was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place, to create a place where everyone, regardless of their position, was treated with the respect they deserved. The next morning, social media was buzzing with what happened at the Golden Crown Hotel. A young couple who had witnessed the entire scene had shared the story online, and it quickly went viral. People from all over were sharing their own experiences of workplace discrimination and celebrating Mrs. Chen's response to the situation. Local news vans parked outside the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of the owner who had gone undercover as a waitress. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Staff members walked with an extra spring in their step, proud to work for someone who stood up for their dignity. Did you see the comments online? Maya asked Kai as they prepared for breakfast service. People are calling Mrs. Chen a hero. Someone even made a meme of her transformation from waitress to boss. Mr. Rodriguez gathered the staff for their morning meeting, where Mrs. Chen made a surprise announcement. Starting today, we're implementing new policies across all our hotels, she declared, looking at her team with pride. Any guest who displays discriminatory behavior will receive one warning. If it continues, they'll be asked to leave and banned from all our properties. The room erupted in applause. A housekeeper wiped tears from her eyes. She had dealt with similar treatment for years, but never felt empowered to speak up. But that's not all, Mrs. Chen continued. We're establishing a respect and dignity training program for all our guests who book events here. Before any corporate function or society gathering, the organizers must attend a brief session about treating staff with respect. The phone lines at the hotel were ringing nonstop. Other luxury hotels called to learn about implementing similar policies. Business leaders wanted to book Mrs. Chen for speaking engagements about workplace dignity. Morning shows competed for the first interview with the undercover boss who taught 5 socialites an unforgettable lesson. But the most surprising call came from the blonde woman's mother, the former waitress. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My daughter called me last night for the first time in years. She apologized for being ashamed of my work and asked to hear my stories about those days." In the hotel restaurant, guests now made a point of learning their servers' names and thanking them properly. Some even shared their own stories of working in service jobs to pay for school or support their families. The 5 women's social circle was buzzing with the news. Some of their friends distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with such behavior. Others reached out to Mrs. Chen, wanting to know how they could help promote workplace respect. During lunch service, a young girl tugged on Maya's sleeve. "Are you like Mrs. Chen?" she asked innocently. "My mom says everyone who works here is special because they work hard and deserve respect." The hotel's booking system crashed briefly when the Staff Appreciation Day was announced as a public event. Hundreds of people wanted to attend, not just to support the staff, but to witness the 5 women working as servers. Mrs. Chen sat in her office, reading through countless messages of support. One caught her eye. A hotel owner in another city asking for help implementing similar policies. "Your actions reminded me of my own journey from bellhop to owner," he wrote. "It's time we all stood up for workplace dignity." She looked out her window at the growing crowd of reporters and supporters. What had started as a simple undercover mission had sparked a movement. People weren't just talking about one incident at one hotel. They were discussing respect, dignity, and the way we treat each other. A comment on social media summed it up perfectly. In a world where you can be anything, be like Mrs. Chen, someone who never forgot where they came from and stands up for what's right. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow on the hotel's windows, Mrs. Chen smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage, like a hotel owner putting on a waitress uniform and serving dinner to 5 women who needed to learn a valuable lesson. A month had passed since that unforgettable night at the Golden Crown Hotel. The morning of the Staff Appreciation Day arrived bright and clear. The hotel lobby buzzed with excitement as employees gathered, wearing their best uniforms, ready to witness something extraordinary. The 5 women arrived early, dressed in the same uniforms they had once mocked. The blonde woman's hands shook slightly as she tied her apron. Her mother, the former waitress, stood nearby, beaming with pride at her daughter's willingness to learn and change. "Remember," Mrs. Chen addressed them kindly, "today isn't about punishment. It's about understanding. She handed each woman a schedule. They would spend the day doing everything from serving tables to cleaning rooms. The hotel was packed. Word had spread, and people had come from all over to support the event. Regular guests sat next to social media influencers, all waiting to be served by the 5 women who had learned a valuable lesson about respect. "Table 7 needs water refills," Maya called out gently to the blonde woman, who nodded and hurried to help. Her designer heels had been replaced with comfortable work shoes, and her perfectly styled hair was tied back practically. In the kitchen, another of the women struggled with a heavy tray of dishes. Chef Thompson showed her the proper way to balance it, just as he'd done for countless new servers over the years. "Remember," he said kindly, "we all started somewhere." The dining room was filled with meaningful moments. One woman, who had complained about water spots on silverware, now understood the effort required to polish each piece. Another, who had made fun of servers' knowledge, found herself struggling to remember the wine list she had once claimed was basic. But something unexpected was happening too. The women were changing. The blonde woman's genuine thank you to the dishwasher made him smile. Another woman stopped to help a housekeeper who had dropped her supplies without a second thought about her manicured nails. During the lunch rush, a demanding customer snapped at one of the 5 women. Her face flushed with recognition. She had been just like that a month ago. Instead of crumbling, she handled the situation with grace, remembering how the hotel staff had treated her despite her behavior. Mrs. Chen watched from a corner, noting how her regular staff supported the temporary servers, showing the same patience and kindness they always displayed. It was a masterclass in human dignity. By afternoon, the women's feet ached, their backs were sore, and their makeup had long since faded. But their eyes held a new understanding. The blonde woman was overheard telling a young guest, "Everyone who works here is amazing. They make it look easy, but it's not." The local news covered the event, interviewing guests and staff. One reporter asked Mrs. Chen if she thought the women had learned their lesson. She smiled and pointed to where the blonde woman was carefully explaining the menu to an elderly couple, her manner gentle and respectful. "Sometimes," Mrs. Chen replied, "the best way to understand someone's journey is to walk a mile in their shoes. Or in this case, to work a shift in their uniform." As the day wound down, the 5 women gathered in the staff room, their faces tired but transformed. The blonde woman spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "I always thought success meant having people serve you. Today, I learned it's about how you serve others." The other staff members applauded, and genuine smiles were exchanged. Someone brought out a cake, and soon the room was filled with chatter and laughter. The barriers of status and privilege had melted away, replaced by simple human connection. Outside, the sun was setting on another busy day at the Golden Crown Hotel. But this wasn't just any day. It was the day when 5 women who had looked down on servers became servers themselves, and in doing so, discovered something about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of class. 6 months later, the Golden Crown Hotel hosted a special celebration dinner. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, but the real magic was in the mix of people gathered there. Hotel staff, from housekeepers to managers, sat alongside regular guests and even some local celebrities. Mrs. Chen stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. Her cream-colored suit matched the elegant decor, but her warm smile matched the genuine atmosphere of the evening. "Tonight," she began, "we're celebrating more than just a successful year. We're celebrating a change in how we see each other." In the front row sat the 5 women who had started it all, but they were different now. The blonde woman had traded her designer clothes for a simple business suit, and her face showed genuine happiness rather than practiced superiority. After that night 6 months ago, Mrs. Chen continued, something remarkable happened. Our story inspired other hotels, restaurants, and businesses to look at how they treat their workers. But more importantly, it made people look at how they treat each other. She gestured to a large screen behind her, where photos began to play. The 5 women serving during Staff Appreciation Day. The blonde woman hugging her mother, the former waitress. Staff members smiling proudly in their uniforms. "The blonde woman here," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to one of the photos, "now runs our new hospitality training program. She teaches guests and corporate clients about respect in the service industry. And who better to teach it than someone who learned it firsthand?" The crowd applauded as the blonde woman stood briefly, nodding with grateful tears in her eyes. Her mother beamed beside her, holding her hand tightly. 3 of our other special guests, Mrs. Chen continued, have started a foundation that provides scholarships to service industry workers who want to advance their education. The 5th woman now volunteers weekly at a local shelter, serving meals to those in need. The hotel's booking system had been upgraded to include a respect pledge that all guests must agree to. Other hotels had adopted similar policies, creating a ripple effect across the industry. But the real change, Mrs. Chen said, her voice softening, happened in the small moments. The guest who learned her server's name was taking night classes and offered to tutor her. The businessman who noticed his housekeeper looking tired and called the front desk to make sure she got a break. The wedding party that invited their servers to sit down and enjoy a slice of cake with them. She paused, looking around the room. We all have a choice in how we treat people. Every day, every interaction is a chance to show respect or withhold it. The uniform someone wears doesn't define their worth, their character does. The evening concluded with a surprise announcement. The Golden Crown Hotel was launching a new program called Walk in Their Shoes, where executives and wealthy clients could volunteer to work alongside hotel staff, learning firsthand about different roles. Our first participants, Mrs. Chen revealed with a smile, are the children of our 5 special guests. They asked to learn what their mothers learned, that every job has dignity and every person deserves respect. As the night wound down, Mrs. Chen watched people mingling, talking, and laughing together. Hotel staff chatted comfortably with guests, no longer afraid of being looked down upon. The 5 women who had once caused such pain were now part of the solution, helping create a more respectful world. The last photo on the screen showed Mrs. Chen in her waitress uniform from that fateful night, standing proudly with her staff. Below it were the words that had become the hotel's new motto, "In a world where you can be anything, be kind." As guests began to leave, many stopped to hug the staff members who had served them. The blonde woman was overheard telling a young server, "Never let anyone make you feel small. The size of your heart matters more than the size of your paycheck." The Golden Crown Hotel stood tall against the night sky, its lights shining bright. But the real brightness came from within, from people who had learned that true class isn't about how much money you have or what you wear, but how you treat others along life's journey.